There's one misconception about Ed Gein that needs to be corrected.
He's small, he's very diminutive stature. He doesn't appear to be threatening to anybody. They all are in agreement that he is psychotic. And they describe him as schizophrenic, which is clearly, I think, the case when you look at Ed Gein's history.
He looked like the kind of neighbor who'd quietly help you fix a fence without saying much. Awkward, soft-spoken, a little strange, sure, but nothing that sets off alarms. In a town with barely 700 people, you learn to accept quirks fast. What you don't expect is nightmare fuel. You don't expect evil to step out of a snow-dusted Wisconsin farmhouse on a cold November morning and rewrite true crime history forever. And yet, that's exactly what happened. This is the rise and the ugly collapse of Ed Gein, a painfully shy handyman from Plainfield, Wisconsin, whose name would later become shorthand for absolute horror. This isn't just a crime story, it's about control, isolation, and a life shaped by fear. A boy raised to worship his mother and distrust the outside world. A mind slowly twisted by grief, obsession, and fantasy until reality finally cracked. This is how he became what he became, why he hid in plain sight for so long, and how small mistakes plus mounting pressure finally ripped the mask clean off. So let's get into it. Edmund Emil Gein was born on the 27th of August, 1906, in La Crosse County, Wisconsin. His mother, Augusta, was deeply religious, harsh, and controlling to the extreme. She believed the outside world was soaked in sin, and her Bible wasn't comfort, it was a weapon. His father, George, drank heavily and drifted from job to job, barely present and completely powerless in the home. Between them, they built a household where shame was the air you breathed. Augusta preached that women, except herself, of course were dangerous and corrupting. She taught Ed and his our brother Henry, that desire was filthy, and intimacy was a trap waiting to destroy them. She warned them constantly that the world would ruin them if they let it. Then she made sure they never had the chance. The boys were isolated, homeschooled in scripture, and kept away from normal social life. Ed was told repeatedly that he was weak and that only his mother knew the path to salvation. When Ed was still young, the family moved to Plainfield, a lonely stretch of central Wisconsin surrounded by fields and trees. Augusta loved it there. Fewer neighbors meant fewer sins and total control. Ed liked it there too because Ed liked whatever his mother liked. His entire world tightened around her, shrinking day by day until nothing else really mattered. From the time he was a kid, people noticed something was off. He laughed at the wrong moments, copied how others talked, blushed fast, and came across awkward and soft. He wanted friends, but conversations never flowed right, like he was always a beat behind. Dating was never even an option. In his house, women were split into two categories, pure saints or dangerous demons, and there was only one saint allowed in Ed's world, and that was his mother. As Ed moved into his teens and early adulthood, the Gein farmhouse began to close in not physically, but psychologically. Augusta sealed off rooms, especially the parlor and her bedroom, treating them like sacred relics that could never be touched. The rest of the house became Ed's space, and it slowly collapsed into chaos. Newspapers stacked high, tools scattered everywhere, junk pile, deed up without order. When his father George died in 1940, the pressure only grew heavier. Ed and his brother Henry took odd jobs around town to survive. People hired Ed because he was cheap, quiet, and didn't talk back. He fixed fences, did small repairs, and babysat for families. Folks described him as strange but harmless. He didn't swear, didn't drink, and never caused trouble, but that house kept shrinking around him. Then came May 16th, 1944. A brush fire broke out on the Gein property, and Henry was reported missing. When authorities searched the nearby marsh, they found Henry face down and lifeless at just 43 years old. The official cause was asphyxiation, but whispers spread fast. Some noticed bruises on his head. Others said the scene looked staged, like Ed already knew exactly where the body was. No one could prove what really happened that day, and that question still hangs heavy. But what mattered most was what Henry's death left behind. No buffer, no outside voice, just Augusta and her devoted son. 2 years later, on December 29th, 1945, Augusta died, and Ed completely unraveled. She had been his compass, his rulebook, his entire universe. Without her, the grief wasn't just sadness, it was total freefall. At 39 years old, Ed sealed off the room she loved forever and let the rest decay. He slept near the kitchen stove like a frightened child hiding from the dark. The farmhouse became a shrine, and Ed became its silent caretaker. Without his mother to define reality, Ed searched for meaning elsewhere. He turned to books and magazines, anatomy texts, pulp horror, detective stories, and articles about surgical changes and transformations. He read about grave robbing and taxidermy. He wasn't just reading, he was searching for a shape that felt safe, something that reminded him of his mother, something that could quiet the fear, the loneliness, and the silence closing in on him. Sometime around 1947, Ed crossed a line he could never come back from. He started visiting local cemeteries late at night, moving quietly, unseen, and completely alone. He focused on recent burials of middle-aged women who reminded him of Augusta. Later, he claimed he entered a kind of trance, like he wasn't fully present during what he was doing. He carefully opened graves, removed what he wanted, then restored everything so neatly that families had no idea anything was wrong. It wasn't until police later checked the sites that disturbed coffins were discovered. Ed brought items back to the farmhouse, bones, skin, and other remains, and treated them the way a hunter processes an animal. He taught himself how to preserve and shape material, turning it into objects meant to be worn or displayed. There were masks made from preserved skin hanging on the walls, clothing pieces stitched together, household items crafted from bone. What he was building wasn't random, it was deliberate. He was assembling a disguise, a costume meant to let him step into the feeling of being his mother, if only for moments at a time. And here's the part that still shocks people. Out in town, no one noticed anything different. Folks still saw the quiet handyman, the cheap labor, the M, and who babysat, read the newspaper at the hardware store, and kept his head down. But back at the farmhouse, something dark was growing room by room, piece by piece. On December 8th, 1954, Mary Hogan vanished from her tavern in nearby Pine Grove. There was blood on the floor and the cash register was gone. Mary was well known, and her disappearance left the town shaken. Ed even joked later that Mary was at his place, and people laughed it off. Plainfield was the kind of town where things stayed invisible if you didn't look too hard. Then came November 16th, 1957. Snow lightly covered Plainfield, and deer season had just begun. Bernice Worden opened her hardware store early that morning. A receipt was written for antifreeze, the last entry she ever made. By afternoon, the store was empty. Blood led toward the back, and her truck was missing. Her son, Deputy Sheriff Frank Worden, reviewed the receipt and saw a familiar name, Ed Gein. Deputies went to the farmhouse as night fell and the cold set in. What they found there ripped Plainfield straight out of normal life and dropped it into pure horror. Inside a shed, Bernice's body was found suspended, treated the same way hunters prepare game. Inside the house, officers discovered masks made from preserved skin, skull pieces shaped into bowls, containers of bones, and other carefully kept remains. This wasn't chaos, it was a collection. An entire inventory that shattered the quiet routine of deer season and exposed a nightmare hiding in plain sight. At the time, Nobody even had the words for what they were dealing with. Ed didn't run far after it all came crashing down. When deputies arrested him, he didn't fight back or panic. He actually seemed relieved, like someone pulled out of deep water right before they were about to sink for good. Sitting at the interrogation table, he spoke softly, politely, just like he always had. He admitted to killing Bernice Worden. He admitted to grave robbing dozens of times, almost always at night, focusing on recent burials. He also admitted responsibility for Mary Hogan's disappearance. And when investigators asked why he made the suit, Ed didn't dodge the question. He said it plainly: he wanted to become his mother. He wanted to crawl into her skin in the most literal way possible. Grief and obsession had completely fused. Investigators didn't stop there. They exhumed graves and confirmed the pattern Ed described. Coffins had been disturbed, remains tampered with not every grave he mentioned, but more than enough to prove this wasn't fantasy or exaggeration. Now, you can't talk about Ed Gein without touching on psychology, but this is where people often get sloppy. It's easy to sensationalize, to throw around labels that flatten what was actually a very specific kind of damage. What we do know is this: Augusta's rigid control, moral absolutism, and emotional domination shaped everything. Women were reduced to a binary pure or corrupt, sacred or filthy. There was no middle ground. That left Ed with no model for adult intimacy at all. He could either worship women or erase them. Since his mother was the only woman he was allowed to admire, he spent years trying to recreate that bond after she was gone. The farmhouse played a role too. That level of isolation works like a pressure cooker. Ed barely interacted with anyone, and no one was there to challenge his thoughts as they spiraled. After Augusta died, Ed sealed off her rooms and kept them spotless, untouched, like a shrine. That was his way of pretending she was still in control and the world was still proper. Meanwhile, the parts of the house he actually lived in collapsed into chaos, trash everywhere, decay, neglect. It mirrored what was happening inside his mind. And then there's compulsion. Some violent offenders are driven by domination over a living victim, but Ed's behavior looks different. His actions were ritualistic and repetitive. The urge wasn't about causing pain, it was about collecting, shaping, arranging, and wearing objects. The satisfaction came from assembling the scene, not from making someone suffer. He withdrew completely and built a private world out of household items and preserved materials. Think of it like stage setting, an attempt to recreate feelings tied to his mother and his warped understanding of womanhood. A ritual meant to control the chaos inside his head, not a hunt for power over a resisting victim. There was a fantasy rehearsal element to all of this. Years of reading anatomy books, studying taxidermy, and obsessing over grave-robbing stories slowly turned the unthinkable into a step-by-step blueprint. You normalize what you practice, that's how the human brain works. For Ed, the line didn't get crossed all at once. He drifted toward it piece by pie. Ease, conditioning himself over time. None of this excuses anything, he did not even close. But it does map out what happens to a mind raised to fear normal human connection and then locked alone with that fear for decades. Isolation didn't create the thoughts, but it let them grow unchecked. So why didn't anyone stop him sooner? Two reasons explain it: camouflage and complacency. In a small town, being useful and quiet buys you a lot of grace. Ed fixed fences. He babysat kids. He didn't drink, didn't curse, didn't raise his voice. He turned red when someone told a dirty joke. That polite, harmless image stayed glued to him the entire time, and that was the camouflage. Mary Hogan's disappearance bothered people, but it stood alone. One case can fade in a town used to minding its business. Bernice Worden's disappearance changed everything, not just because she vanished, but because her son was law enforcement and because a receipt named a suspect. Until those two lines crossed a missing woman and Ed's name in her handwriting, he sat perfectly hidden inside normal life. There were signs, sealed rooms, living areas buried in trash, the offhand joke about Mary being at his place. the way he lingered too long chatting behind Bernice's counter. But in rural life, where winters drag on and work never stops, people don't pry. That's how communities survive, and it's also how predators stay invisible. Once in custody, Ed was examined and declared legally insane. He was initially ruled incompetent to stand trial and committed to Central State Hospital. Years later, doctors deemed him .com, petant, and in 1968 he was formally tried for the murder of Bernice Worden. The judge found him guilty, then immediately ruled him not guilty by reason of insanity. Ed was sent to Mendota Mental Health Institute in Madison, where he would spend the rest of his life. The farmhouse didn't wait for a verdict. In March of 1958, just 1 year after Ed's arrest, it burned to the ground while sitting empty. Arson was suspected, but Plainfield had zero interest in preserving a reminder of what had lived there. At auction, the county sold off what remained, including Ed's old Ford, the one used to haul remains from cemeteries. A carnival operator bought it and turned it into a traveling sideshow attraction. Ed himself never left institutional walls again. He died on the 26th of July, 1984, from respiratory failure due to cancer. He was buried back in Plainfield, not far from the very graves he once disturbed. Ed Gein's crimes ripped a hole straight through the American psyche. This wasn't something people were ready to process, and we've rarely seen anything quite like it since. His story inspired fictional monsters like Norman Bates, Leatherface, and Buffalo Bill. Each borrowed pieces of the real horror, the mother fixation, the isolated farmhouse, the skin-based disguises. Fiction exaggerated what reality had already made unbearable, and that's what makes Ed Gein's story still so disturbing today. The real story is smaller and sadder than the legends built around it. A lonely man in a collapsing house, building shrines to a mother he couldn't let go of, and a version of womanhood he never learned at how to approach. Grief slowly turned into ritual, and ritual hardened into violence. In the final weeks before his arrest, the tension was already buzzing. A man who had hidden in the shadows for years was starting to fray at the edges. Money was running thin. He sold off most of his land, shrinking his world down to the house and a small yard like a bunker. He spent more time in town, especially at the hardware store. Deer season created excuses. Antifreeze, ammunition, gloves, perfect reasons to linger and talk. He watched Bernice Worden, asked about prices, came back again and again. The day before she vanished, he asked about antifreeze once more, making sure she'd be there early. This wasn't random, he was planning. That receipt from the morning of her disappearance was the mistake he could never undo. He had always operated at night, in silence, unseen. The purchase itself was normal, but the timing wasn't. Back at the farmhouse, his collection was growing bolder, riskier. Every new object increased the chance someone might stumble onto the truth, but no one did until law enforcement showed up. If you follow true crime long enough, certain patterns start repeating: control, grievance, fantasy, opportunity. Ed Gein didn't have the highest body count, and he wasn't some criminal mastermind, but he sat right at the crossroads of those patterns and struck a deep cultural nerve. He represents the collision of American ideas about purity, motherhood, frontier isolation, and do-it-yourself survival, crashing headfirst into untreated mental illness and obsession we remember high. Because he forces us to picture what we don't want to imagine, not just violence, but desecration. A man who looked ordinary while crossing every boundary we rely on to feel safe. There's another reason this story still matters. It reminds us that an ordinary exterior can hide something deeply wrong. That horror doesn't always look wild or loud. Sometimes it wears work clothes, does chores, says ma'am, and keeps its head down. When we say, "It couldn't happen here," we focus on what was found behind closed doors but forget the quiet figure moving through everyday life. That figure could be anywhere. This is the true crime saga of Ed Gein, a story about isolation, indoctrination, and how devotion can twist into something dangerous when there's no one left to draw the line. If you're into deep dive stories that explore not just the crimes, but the psychology, the slow build, and the small mistakes that lead to collapse, hit subscribe, share this story, and I'll see you on the next one.